Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at the AAVMC. So on today's show, we are discussing AAVMC and its role in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the veterinary profession. Now, AAVMC has a pretty long history of working on these issues. Shortly after the founding of the organization, the group constituted a committee on multicultural affairs. And that group really was the tip of the spear, so to speak, with respect to diversity and inclusion in the profession. That group was responsible for bringing the Iris and Bell Symposium to AAVMC, for insisting that we collect demographic data. Individuals on that committee are largely responsible for some of the most impactful diversity recruiting and retention programs that exist at schools across the nation today. So we were really indebted to the leadership of the AAVMC at that time and to the members of the committee for bringing us to this point. Now in 2005, we'll talk a little bit about what happened just preceding 2005 today, but we launched the Diversity Matters Initiative, which is typically what most people know us for now. It's hard to believe that that was 15 years ago. I have a lot more gray hair than I did when I started in this position. So much has changed over the years, and I feel like we've made really incredible strides. But as with everything, there's always much more work to be done. So 2 months ago, when the nation and actually the world kind of rose up in response to the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, veterinary medicine was also called upon to respond to what has kind of evolved into this kind of great reckoning with respect to race, not just in the US, but globally. And AAVMC, under the leadership of today's guest, stepped right on out there and responded. So it is my pleasure to welcome AAVMC CEO, Dr. Andrew Maccabe, to the show. Yay. For folks
Thank you, Lisa. Glad to be here.
Yeah, for folks that don't know, Andy's my boss. So I've been hosting the show now for about 5 years, close to 5 years this fall. And this is the first time, sadly, that I've invited him on as a guest. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lisa.
Great. So as is our custom on the show, I have my guests do a bit of self-introduction before we dive into our topic.
Well, thanks again very much for the invitation. And before I start with that, I will say this was the show that probably needed to come onto, so it was all right to wait for 5 years. And we'll talk more about it later, but I do want to put this marker down. When we think about all the threats that are facing this profession and all the opportunities that we have, I really do believe that the single most important issue that we have to deal with in this profession is the topic of diversity. Our profession must become more diverse if we're going to be able to handle the challenges of the future. If we fail to do so, it'll be an existential threat to our very future. So I'm really glad to be here, Lisa, and have an opportunity to share with you some of my ideas. I'll tell you real quickly, I'm a 1985 graduate of Ohio State. I began my career in a mostly dairy practice in Northeast Ohio, where I had the great opportunity to work, mostly dairy operations there and a little bit of public health. Subsequent to that, I entered active duty in the Air Force, where I spent a total of 25 years doing public health, traveling around the world, getting kind of a global perspective. But somewhere in the middle there, I left that to join AAVMC in the early 2000s, stayed for a period of about 5 years, and then I went for a brief period of time to work with CDC, where I was CDC's liaison to the Food and Drug Administration for about another 5 years before I returned to AAVMC in 2012. And that's where you find me now.
Yeah. And so this is something that Andy and I actually have in common. We are the two boomerangs at AAVMC. We've left and come back. So I'm really excited about this conversation. So thanks for being here. So tell us the story from your perspective. Describe the origins of the Diversity Matters Initiative.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in your opening comments some of the early work that this association has done with regards to diversity almost since our very founding in 1966 as an association. It was in the 1970s that the association established the Multicultural Affairs Committee, and that laid the groundwork for much of the subsequent work that we've been able to do. But it was in 2002 when a predecessor of mine in this position, Larry Hyder, who was formerly the dean of the Atlantic Veterinary College at Prince Edward Island, and also a dairy guy from Ohio, which is where I first met Larry when I was going to school. He was on the faculty when I was a student there. But as the executive director of this association, Larry continued to build on the work of many others, including yet a former executive director, Billy Hooper, who was a strong champion of diversity and inclusion in veterinary medicine. But it was Larry who was transformative when he took a proposition to the board of directors to say that we need to hire a full-time permanent person who's going to work on this issue if we're going to make any advancement. And the board recognized that vision. They saw the importance of this position. And most especially, Larry had the great vision to hire probably the preeminent director for diversity and inclusion of any association. But no, actually, Lisa, it was that's when we hired you and brought you in to be part of our team and develop the Diversity Matters program. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about the impact, but that was a transformational move for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was also like this, there was an article too that was published in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education around that time that also kind of played a little bit of an influence there. And the article's title was something like Veterinary Medicine, the most segregated of all of the health professions. And I just remember that Larry was really quite upset about that. And there was a kind of a back and forth with the editor. And I have this letter somewhere in my files that says, where the editor wrote back was like, yes, I know that is upsetting. And it's true. Like, you know.
Actually, I do remember that the title of that article was the most racist profession in America. And I think actually it's very apropos of the current dialogue and discussion that's going on today. Racism and being called racist obviously has negative connotations. And I think what the challenge there is it makes people very defensive. In this particular situation, it had the desired effect insofar as it resulted in change. But I think in my view, the reason the term is justified and was justified then, even though it stung and it hurt, is what the editor and the author of that article were speaking to is the systemic racism that occurs throughout so many institutions, higher education in general, and in veterinary medical education in particular. In fact, we have a history of actively discriminating against minorities and against women in this profession. We are beyond that time now, but the vestiges of that continue to this day. So I think it was a call to action that had a desired effect. It got attention.
It did. So we are 15 years since that time now. So what do you think about the development and expansion of the program over the years?
Well, it's been huge. And I think the data speaks for itself that we can see a dramatic increase in the number of underrepresented minorities enrolled in our programs. And we can see dramatic progress in our admissions practices and the evidence basis that we're building to support these efforts. So when I look at the types of things that we've been able to do as an association with your leadership, Lisa, it revolves around the data. It's about meetings, it's about projects, it's about communications, it's about putting attention on this issue. The framework that we've used in the association is analyze, catalyze, and advocate. So again, under the analyze function, we have the best source of data about the demographics of the profession or of the enrollment, both the applicant pool and the enrolled student body. And we make that a front and center piece of our public data set. We're not shy about sharing that data and demonstrating where we've had positive effect and where we still need to have do some work. Under the catalyze function, the various meetings that we've had, you mentioned the Iverson-Bell Symposium that we've held, and now many regional Iverson-Bell Symposia too have been spawned from that effort. I also want to mention the pilot project that you initiated on holistic admissions, and to get our schools and our admissions committees working together to say, what are some of the practices that are effective, what works, and how can we recruit and admit more underrepresented minorities in veterinary medicine. And then finally, the advocacy, the communications and outreach part of what we do. Everything from featuring this topic in our directed communications channels, but also our very strong position statements. And I have to commend the diversity committee that I know you worked with, Lisa, on developing our principles of inclusion, which have been very strong and served as a foundation for us to take a position and to advance our work in this issue. So all of these things collectively have raised us to a completely new level in diversity and inclusion.
So what has been the impact? Certainly we know that there's been, you mentioned the data show that we've certainly increased representation, right? The kind of structural diversity. But what do you think has been the kind of larger impact on academic veterinary medicine and then maybe the profession more broadly?
Yeah, so I think, that's one measure of outcome, right? It's the number of students, and it's convenient because they're countable and we can keep track of that. And it's dramatic, but it's kind of a lagging indicator, meaning we had to do a lot of work beforehand, before those numbers started changing. So I think the biggest impact has been, first of all, about the consolidation of all of these different efforts that were going on, different bits and pieces, bringing it together and adding focus and a sense of purpose to this whole effort. And again, I think that's an area where the association has been able to lead. There was a lot of good work being done by our member institutions, but they were limited in scope and they couldn't, they were all doing things independently. By elevating this program into the status that it has at the association as a signature program front and center, we've been able to align a number of different initiatives. And there's a lot of different definitions of strategy, but that's one of my favorite ones. Is strategy is when you bring alignment to all of your programs and get them all working in the same direction. Even if they have slightly different goals and objectives, they are all aiming the same way. And I think that's what the Diversity Matters program has been. The big impact has been to focus our efforts and get us going in a single direction.
So, and what about the association as a collective? Certainly, we are all kind of now moving in the same direction. But what about AAVMC as an entity?
Well, I think that by focusing on this effort, we have emerged as a trusted leader and a valued partner in this area. We have developed the expertise over many years so that our member institutions now look to us for support and guidance for their efforts. But we also are a lot of that expertise resides at our member institutions, and we know where some of those very strong programs are, notably the Center for Diversity and Inclusion in Veterinary Medicine at Purdue University. So it's a combination of us leading those groups, but also featuring their expertise. And it's extended beyond academic veterinary medicine, beyond our association. We've had impact on the profession at large. And again, I think it's because we were the first organization to really focus on this in all of organized veterinary medicine. AVMA is one of our strongest partners across the board in everything that we do, and they too have devoted substantial resources to this effort. So we work closely with them, but I'm very proud of the work that this association has done, again, much of it under your leadership, to lead the whole profession and to get things going there. But even beyond the veterinary medical profession, we have also been leaders in the interprofessional area. So we work as part of the Federation of Associations of Schools of the Health Professions. And there are now 15 of those associations, all here in the Washington, D.C. area. All of them have programs in diversity and inclusion. But we are among the leading organizations in that area. And again, that's the impact that it's had, is we're now seen as having the expertise and the credibility to run these programs.
Great. Yeah, I have to say, I'm just so proud of the work that the association has been able to do over my tenure. It's been a real pleasure. And one thing that, when I chat with my diversity colleagues, either in veterinary medicine or outside of the profession, one of the benchmarks that I kind of use as a measure of success in terms of permeating an organization is that I don't have to be in the room, and I know that this topic will still get discussed, and it will be a robust discussion. And so that really, it's always really important to have someone who kind of carries the water on it, but to not have to be there and know that that discussion, a robust discussion on this subject, will still get that airtime, for me, is a real mark of success.
And I remember some of those early discussions we had, Lisa. It's the objective was not to have diversity and inclusion over here as this discrete thing, that, oh, well, when you want to talk about that, you go over here and talk about that. The goal was to have it permeate every single thing that we do, all the way from admissions to well-being to, curriculum, all the way through teaching, research, service, the mission of our member institutions. We wanted to see it permeate every single discussion. We're not quite there, but what you described is, you're right, we've made substantial progress so that it's not just you, and it's not just the diversity committee that are saying, wait, don't forget, what's the diversity element here? What's the diversity component? Now more and more people are raising that on their own. And you're right, you don't have to be right there to do it. There, we've created that culture, I think.
Yeah. So what's next for us in the diversity space at AAVMC? What are you gonna make me do next?
Well, we have spent a little bit of time talking about some of the great successes that we have had, and some of the impact that we've had, and some of the leadership that we've been able to demonstrate in this area, and that's all good. We've built a strong foundation in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would say that is a necessary but not sufficient standpoint. So when I talk about diversity, and our work there, I think it began with raising awareness of the topic, developing an appreciation for the differences that people from different backgrounds bring. When we talk about equity, we talk about removing the barriers and obstacles and trying to level the playing field. And we've done a fair amount of work there. There's more yet to be done. When we talk about inclusion, I think about preparing a welcoming environment at our colleges where every student can succeed and where they are not confronted with biases and prejudices. Again, we've made progress, but there's a lot of work to do there. I remember a definition that you gave of this distinction between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is being asked to come to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance. So even if we are successful at admitting underrepresented minorities or people from other diverse backgrounds, that isn't sufficient until we've made a culture, a climate that is welcoming for them to succeed while they're in veterinary school. So like I said, we've developed a strong foundation in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've done all of these things, but I believe, especially with the current political movement, the current environment that we're operating on, we need to build on this strong foundation, and we need to pivot to a much more proactive stance to promote social justice, civil rights, and anti-racism. And by the way, not only is this, good to do for society, but this is a part of our selfish interest. We have to do more to recruit people from diverse backgrounds into this profession. And we will very quickly exhaust all of the diversity that's in our applicant pool unless we move further upstream. By that, I mean, we've got to do much more recruitment in the high school, the pre-college years, high school and middle school, and even reaching into elementary school, primary school, so that we can expose young people to the role of animals in society and careers in veterinary medicine, and maybe get some students, some young people who had not previously considered a career in veterinary medicine to start looking at that. So we've got still a lot of work to do, but I think it's going to be a conscious pivot to social justice, civil rights, and anti-racism.
Exciting. I'm very excited about this. Very excited. So everybody stay tuned. So from a leadership perspective, as the leader of an organization, what advice would you give to your colleagues at other veterinary organizations who might be exploring ways of kind of getting to this space and thinking about diversity initiatives if they don't have one, or expanding?
So the first lesson that I've taken from our experience, and we've mentioned this in several other forums and talked about it in other ways, is the importance of dedicated resources. You cannot advance this type of work by just making it an additional duty for somebody else who has another job. And I think, again, what was transformational for this association was when we created a full-time position for a director for diversity. And then we had the presence of mind to hire you into that position. But the point was, the board dedicated the resources that it would take to make this a full-time job for somebody to manage and to develop the program. So that's number one, is you have to be prepared to dedicate the resources. Number two is it's a marathon, not a sprint. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. We have been very successful, and I think the data shows that we have had a measurable impact on the number of underrepresented minorities enrolled in our school. The curve, the shape of the curve started changing approximately 5 years after you launched the Diversity Matters program. And it has gone steadily steeper since then. And I attribute that to the work that we've done with this program, notably simply by raising awareness of the issue, by publishing and tracking the data, and by removing barriers to admission. Frankly, as important as that work is, that's a low bar, right? Just to raise awareness and remove barriers. All right, so the hard work is coming up, and that is to actively recruit and to change minds and to get get more people interested in careers in veterinary medicine. This is a 30-year plan. It's not going to happen in 3 years. It's not going to happen in 13 years. It's going to take a generation or more, a generation and a half before we start having the sustainable thing. So that's the time and effort, the marathon, not a sprint. And then the last piece of advice I'd mentioned, because again, it keeps rearing its head, and that is be prepared for setbacks and resistance. This is not easy work. Well, let me take that back. There are things you can do that are very superficial, and you can put a check mark. Yep, oh, diversity is important to us. We care about that, and we're done. Next issue. That's not hard. That's easy, but it's also superficial, and it doesn't result in change. The hard work comes when you have to make difficult decisions. When you have to talk about, we're going to move these resources from here to here because this is important. And that oftentimes puts people in defensive positions. I'm thinking now of several of our schools that are dealing with the aftermath of the things you mentioned, the Black Lives Matter, the social unrest, the protest movements and things like that. And several of them are taking steps to actively create a culture or an environment that is more welcoming of minority students and diverse students. And part of that may mean removing the visual reminders of the heritage and the legacy of these schools, which are predominated by white men. And some people say, well, then you're stealing our history. You don't appreciate us. You don't want that. And the answer is no, that's not the case. I don't know of any dean serving today or any college serving today that doesn't celebrate that heritage. But when it is a barrier to inclusiveness, we have to find a different way to celebrate that. So sometimes removing those class pictures, from in some cases over 100 years ago, that were all men and all white. Sometimes that makes for a more inclusive environment when you set those things aside in a different place and make them easily accessible, but you don't feature them front and center. And those are difficult decisions. So be prepared for setbacks and resistance to these changes. That's another piece of advice.
Great advice. And so more broadly, though, as an individual, what advice would you give to your veterinary colleagues on diversity?
Yeah, so the previous things I was saying were more of the organizational, institutional level. And I guess this question would make me want to think more on a personal level. So the first one is, take some time to reflect on this issue and to ponder it. It's very easy to get defensive when people talk about diversity and inclusion, because for many of us, it seems like, are you saying that I'm not inclusive? Are you saying that I don't care about that? And the issue is no, but it's not it's not that at all, but it's very easy to get defensive. So before you get too defensive, first of all, take time to reflect and think about the issue and try to learn more about the issue. That's the first thing that I would say. But secondly, I'd say it's helpful if you're able to adopt a mindset of humility and grace. And And I say that I got a little choked up about it, partly because I've got some allergies, but partly because it's a humbling experience. This issue is a journey for all of us, right? It's a learning journey if you choose it to be. You can close your mind to it and say, not me, that's for somebody else to handle. But if you want to go through the growth experience and take the journey, it's revealing, and it helps if you approach it with some humility and grace. And the part that I was reflecting on earlier when I was thinking about this is I feel that I'm getting closer to that state later in life. I wish I'd been able to achieve that sooner. And not that I've ultimately achieved it, but I'm aiming more towards that direction. And so if I had an opportunity to speak with young people in the profession about it, it would be to develop the tools and techniques to, first of all, avoid defensiveness and develop a sense of humility and grace as you explore these issues.
Great advice, great advice. And one thing I'm so glad that you mentioned the piece about humility and grace. And I think that, that's also a piece that I hope that we'll bring to our pivot towards social justice. And that is the inclusion of the notion of restorative justice, right? And so we're in this period of time where, something happens, someone says something, and then, the world comes crashing down, right? This kind of notion of cancel culture. And I'm not gonna lie, there are times when I am like, big X on you, like I'm done here, right? There's some egregious things where it makes it very difficult to practice restorative justice. However, I think it is really important for us to be mindful and thoughtful and demonstrate grace as recognizing that this is a journey. People are going to say things because they're not really sure of the lingo, or they're not familiar with the data, or the concepts are just so radically new and contrary to their way of thinking that there has to be some space there to allow people to grow without just kind of leaving them in the ditch that we've just kind of might have kicked them in accidentally or on purpose. So we've got to really kind of make sure that we kind of give people those opportunities to grow. And so as we move into kind of a space as an organization thinking about the future of diversity programming, I'm hoping that we'll also be able to spend some time thinking about restorative justice and giving space and time and grace for people to grow, because this isn't this isn't a fly-by-night kind of thing. And I think it's also important for folks to understand that folks from marginalized identities don't necessarily have a complete lock on this D&I knowledge. There's a lot of marginalization that even happens within groups and across groups. And so there's always things for us to learn, and that we just really need to demonstrate that grace as a whole to kind of help move us, again, all in those same directions. So yeah, great advice. Yeah. So any great books before we log off that you've read that you think you might want to recommend to folks to also read?
Well, I know we've talked a little bit already about the book White Fragility, and we're going to have the author, Robin DiAngelo, will be speaking at our annual conference. And again, it's a book that it doesn't have all the answers. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's a book that allowed me to see that some of the things that it was easy for me to say, that's not me, that's some other group that's responsible for that. I didn't have anything to do with that. But when you recognize that, absolutely, nobody said that you did have anything to do with that, right? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what do we need to do as a society to overcome that and to get rid of the institutional racism that occurs. Another book that was also very influential to me in this area was the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that talked about the mass incarceration and how, one system of oppression was just replaced with another, with another, with another. So beginning with slavery, and then the reign of terror, the domestic terrorism and extrajudicial killings and lynchings and things like that, was then replaced with Jim Crow, legalized apartheid, which then has been replaced by mass incarceration. And it's, just one system of oppression after another, that, unless you link those pieces together, you can't see it. So those are, I thought, were some very valuable books that have changed my thinking in this area.
Awesome. Awesome. So be sure, folks, to check that out. There's also lots of really great resources online. There are tons of book lists that have been created in the last couple of months. So be sure to check those out. There's lots of really great resources out there. So with that, I will thank Andy for being a guest on the show. This has been a really great conversation. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you for being a really great leader. It is a joy to work with you. And it is really just been wonderful to be able to grow this program under your leadership. And so thank you for all that you do.
Well, I appreciate that, Lisa. And let me get the last word in then to say, we spoke about this being a journey of growth and discovery for all of us, right? Those of us in majority groups and those of us in minority groups. And I'm just so pleased and privileged to have you as my one of my guides along this journey. And I really appreciate everything that you bring to this job, to this position, and to this association every day. I honestly don't know what we would do without you.
Thank you. Aww. So yes, we're going to end the show on a nice little love fest today. So this has been another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. To Andy, again, thank you so much for being on the show. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. We're on all of them. And be sure to like our Facebook page, which is AAVMC's Diversity Matters on Air. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.